This is TWiT.
All right. And as we always do, we round out this episode of Windows Weekly with the liquor pick of the week. It's a brown liquor. Tell us all about it, Richard.
Well, you're a little bit at a disadvantage, Mike, because you haven't been in all these shows, but I've been touring around. I've been traveling, so often I grab weird whiskeys wherever I am. Last week, it was actually a German single malt that's very good. And who knew it existed? And I've seen a few folks have gone out and found it and had a taste of it and gone, you're right, this is a good single malt from Germany. But I'm actually going back a bit. A few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, when I was in the Netherlands, I was able to get a taste of a bottle of a Balendalek 2016 Benelux edition, only sold in Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg. It was sort of a specialty whiskey. And so I talked about this distillery called the Balendalek, which is in the Space Side. And I'm looking at it as a real 21st century distillery. It's brand new. It's only been around a decade or so. They only work one shift, 5 or 6 people working there, no automation. Like they're really getting back to local grain, local water, local processes. They don't make a lot of it. It's hard to come by. But next door to Balendalek is Cragganmore. And I haven't talked about them before. They're one of what we call the classic malts. When United Distillers in the 80s did this promotion that kind of changed the tone of whiskey around the world, and it became much more hip. It started with this collection they called the classic malts, and Cragganmore is one of them. It was their Speyside representative. And as I've dug deeply into the history of Cragganmore, I suddenly had this connection where just down the road in Balendalek, you had this very ultra contemporary, last decade distillery. Cragganmore was built in the 1800s, but the guy who led it, who was known as, his name was John Smith, they called him Big John Smith, was the definitive expert in making whiskey in the late 1800s. And what he was doing was industrializing whiskey. So this was the fellow that helped lead this idea of getting away from the traditional whiskey approach was, I have a large barley farm and I can't sell all my barley, so I turn some of it into booze and sell it. And now, as industrialization was taking a hold in the United Kingdom, they were able to start building whiskey at much larger scales, and Cragganmore was his demo. So John had worked for Macallan, he'd worked for Glenlivet, he'd worked on Glenfarclas, he'd been at Dalhuane. Like, this is the expert. And now he had an opportunity from scratch to do a new distillery, and he was going to use industrial approaches. And that's why he picked that location near Balendalek, because it was on the Strathspey Railway. And so, he had this mind. His point was, I now have trains that will bring me coal and barrels, and I will send out whiskey at scale. By the way, that train line doesn't exist anymore. They turned it into a walking path called the Speyside Way. So it's cool. But this is really what this is about. This whole idea of a professional, serious distillery. He actually leased the land from George McPherson Grant. That's the Balendalek folks. And they built the facility in 1867. And by 1887, they had their first run. And so the 300 casks of Cragganmore then went by train for the first time ever to Aberdeen from Balendalek. They called it the Whiskey Special. And so operated happily to about in the early 1900s. 1901 had a major refurbishment. Most of the buildings that you see today at Cragganmore are from the Charles Doig refurbishment in 1901. Of course, was shut down during World War I. They got light by the end of the war. They were getting electric lights for the first time. And then in the early 20s, the family sold the entire thing off to a new entity called the Cragganmore Glenlivet Distillery, which was owned equally by Peter Mackey, which was White Horse Distillers, becoming the large industrial distillers, and George McPherson Grant, the guy who owns the land, so 50-50 share. But a few years later, White Horse Distillers gets scooped up by an even larger group called the Distillers Company, or DCL. And this is the path that leads to Diageo. Of course, the Depression, World War II, lots of restrictions. They go over to steam in the 1960s. And in 1965, DCL buys the rest of Cragganmore from the McPherson Grant family, which is when the McPherson Grants effectively got out of making whiskey until they got in 10, 15 years ago with Ballandalic. Then, 20 years later, you get the United Distillers Classic Malts. That's what DCL becomes. And, the rest is history. Cragganmore 12 was their definitive version. Then by the 90s, that becomes Diageo, the largest liquor company in the world. And the more I learn about these companies, the less I hate them. Like, you don't want to like big conglomerates, but they tend to preserve brands, techniques, styles, equipment. They've those stills from the 1800s, which are unusual stills. They're flat top stills. They have had them remade 3 times in the past 100 years. They're identical to the ones that Big John Smith put in the 1860s.
Whoa.
Why? How do you be angry with these people? They're making the product the way it was always made. They've improved their barley production. They centralized their bottling. But for the most part, it's the same water, in the same stills, in the same location. So while they do produce 1.5 million liters a year, so a large scale operation, they use European large washbacks, which is what Big John put in back then. So that's the big barrels that they do the fermentation in. And then they only have 2 wash stills and 2 spirit stills. They're relatively large, although, like I said, unusual shape. They have the flat top instead of having a long carving lie arm into the swan neck. They do use a little bit of peat. They always did back then, even though peat was relatively hard to come by. It's easier now with Diageo. They don't do their own maltings. That's normal. All of those largely ended by the 1970s. They store about 360,000 casks across 3 dunnage-style warehouses. So that's the barrels are on their sides, in racks, 3 high. Those buildings were 100 years old, and they age in bourbon, sherry, and port caskings. There are a bunch of special editions of Cragganmore, but the one you'll be able to find is the original. It's basically been the same since the classic malts in the 1980s. So for 40 years, Cragganmore 12 has been the same. It's about $60 US. It's 40% ABV. It is colored and it is chill filtered. So it is industrial whiskey, no two ways about it. And it is tasty. That is a proper space side whiskey. It was right for United Distillers to say, this is our representation of the space side.
Why color it?
Make it consistent. Different barrels release a different amount of color into the wood. Like the spirit goes in clear, right? It's a solvent. Here's the joke, Micah. Here's the joke about whiskey and all of these boozes. Because I was drinking rum last night. It's not the alcohol is a solvent. You're drinking wood. That's what you like. You like the flavors of wood. Mm-hmm. The solvent is clear.
I feel like it could be marketed better than that.
Yes.
but you're drinking wood. What is wrong with you?
But last night, and I'm not saying this is a smart thing to do, but it's something I did. I lined up an ounce of 15-year-old whiskey, a 12-year-old cognac, and a 15-year-old rum, all barrel aged. They were all about the same color, and they really don't taste that different. I defy you to say this is the cognac versus this is the whiskey versus this was a rum, because once they've had a decade in wood, it tastes like wood, and it's tasty, like it's very yummy. But it's just this illusion that the alcohol source matters all that much. It does a little. It's subtle, but in the end, these are solvents, and they pull phenols and compounds out of the wood that we enjoy. And one little kicker to the story that I actually said this in Ballandalic, that when Ballandalic went into operation, Diageo gave them the original 1869 spirit safe from Cragganmore that George McPherson Grant had originally helped finance 150 years before. And that's the one that Ballandalic now uses. And again, how do you hate a company, even though it's a giant conglomerate that's bought everything up, when they do these little things, like very thoughtful? So I've been meaning to get to Cragganmore eventually. It's one of the legit, really great whiskeys and part of that great series. But it was even more fun to dig into the history and realize how all these folks work together and the evolution of that. So side by side, within a half a mile of each other, is the definitive 19th century industrialized distillery just up the road from a 21st century ultra craft distillery.